Good evening. Good evening. I'm David Reese, Chair of the Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the last meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2022, and on or before September 30th, 2023. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Christina DeRose. Robert Ehrlich. Shayla Garcia.
Present.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera.
Present.
Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Sultran.
Present.
David Reese present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. Before we proceed to adopt lease guidelines for rent-stabilized apartments, lofts, and hotels, I would like to make a few brief comments on this process. First, on behalf of the board and myself, I would like to thank the hundreds of New Yorkers, tenants, owners, members of advocacy groups, and public officials, including all of you watching and listening tonight, and especially those who testified about their personal experience at our 4 public hearings, and those who took the time to submit written, oral, and video submissions to the board, for participating in the process of determining rent adjustments for New York's roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments. This board recognizes and deeply appreciates your critical contribution to the public conversation. From tenants, we heard deeply moving accounts of the impact of job losses due to the pandemic, leading to their inability to pay rent, which in many instances resulted in the accumulation of rent arrears and the fear of losing their homes. At the same time, we heard from owners of small buildings who are struggling to maintain their apartments and their livelihoods in the face of increased operating costs and the challenges they face from a decrease in rental income and increased vacancies from the impact of COVID-19. This testimony and the public submissions reflect the complexity of the housing landscape in which we must determine fair housing rent adjustments. Second, I would like to recognize and thank the staff members of the RGB for their exceptional research and analysis and coordination of our public meetings. Their professionalism and objectivity are essential to ensuring the board's decisions are fully and accurately informed. Third, I would like to recognize and thank my fellow board members for their support, public service, and dedication to this difficult task. Since there was only one proposal for final hotel language submitted prior to this meeting, we will now consider Proposal 1 for Hotel Order 52. I move to adopt the final language of Proposal 1 for Hotel Order 52 that was circulated to the members of the board and posted on the RGB website on June 17th. And I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Hotel Order 52 substantially in the form submitted by staff to the board as of June 17th, 2022, and to be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adopted rental adjustments. A summary of Hotel Proposal 1 is as follows. 1, residential Class A apartment hotels, 0%. 2, lodging houses, 0%. 3, rooming houses, Class B buildings containing less than 30 units, 0%. 4, Class B hotels, 0%. 5, single room occupancy buildings, MDL Section 248 SROs, 0%. Is there a second for this motion? A second from Christina DeRose. Is there any discussion on this motion? Hearing none, I call the question. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
Yes.
Sorry, yes. Okay, Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
No.
Shayla Garcia, how do you vote?
I vote yes, and I hope we do the same for rent-stabilized apartments.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
Yes.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
No.
Adon Sultran, how do you vote?
Yes, and I also hope that we vote the same way for rent-stabilized apartments.
And David Reese, Chair, I vote yes. 7 in favor, 2 opposed, the motion passes. We will now consider proposals for apartment and loft order 54. Tenant members will get the first opportunity to present a proposal to be considered for final adoption, followed by owner members. Do I hear a proposal?
First, I'd like to make a statement, Chair.
Sure.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I said good evening, everyone. Thank you. Good evening to the members of the public, board members, and staff of the RGB. As you all know, this is my first year sitting on the Rent Guidelines Board, and honestly, this first RGB season has been one of the more frustrating professional endeavors I've participated in recent memory. As I reflect on the last several months, I can say that I stayed true to my word from when I was first appointed by the mayor. I committed to listening intently, digesting the information presented, and making informed decisions. I waited to see how this allegedly neutral process would unfold. Frankly, I've seen enough. As someone who was appointed the evening before the price index and operating cost study was discussed, I didn't know that at that time what I know now, that this impartial and independent body had already decided many of your fates. Looking back, as soon as those commensurate rent adjustment projections came out with the proposed 4 to 9% adjustments, whatever credibility the neutrality of this process had was lost. Why do I feel that way? Because since then, every week, Shayla and I, tenants throughout the city, advocates, and housing experts have fielded every question and every concern of the public members, sometimes asking for favors from people to crunch numbers and provide quantitative data under immense time constraints in order to bolster the firsthand accounts that many of you have provided about the unbelievable struggles tenants are facing. Despite all of our good faith efforts, the public members decided that rather than listen, digest, and make informed decisions, they'd rather keep moving the goalposts. At first it was, well, NOI dropped, so we need to increase rents, as if we didn't anticipate a slight drop in NOI after the changing in the housing law, and as if NOI hasn't increased exponentially the last 40 years. The next day was the myth that the HSTPA makes it impossible for landlords to profit or gain any income to care for their buildings. We know this isn't true because of financing practices and loopholes that exist, and we provided data to show that buildings with more rent-stabilized units are more poorly maintained. The next day, it was the myth of the mom-and-pop landlords struggling as if they make up a large portion of the rent-stabilized housing stock, which we know they don't. They then make it sound as though the assessed values of their building hasn't increased drastically in the last several decades to the point where they could simply sell their buildings for millions and millions of dollars in profit. Every time that we expended time and energy responding to their ever-changing questions, our points were dismissed and new questions and justifications for increasing landlord profit emerged. After responding to question after question, the fact that members of this board began earnestly asking more than once, well, are tenants really struggling that badly, is illuminating enough. Who asked that during an ongoing pandemic, with inflation over 8%, with homelessness and eviction cases at record levels, when the cost of grocery and gas has skyrocketed, when salaries haven't increased to keep up with the increase in expenses, and when rent-stabilized tenants are living in deplorable housing conditions? Yes, deplorable. How many of you testified about rats, roaches, no heat, hot water, inoperable elevators, mold, and harassment by your landlords? So again, what type of people ask whether tenants are really struggling that badly? People who are out of touch. People who do not believe that a 3.5% increase will cripple families and drive them onto the street. People who don't believe that your everyday life decisions will be severely impacted by their votes. These people are either just out of touch, or they're out of touch and they don't care. The comedian John Oliver just did a segment on Sunday, that was about the problems with the rental system here in America. And he said something that was really encapsulating exactly what we've had to deal with on this board. He said, and I quote, "That is the core issue with rental housing in this country, though. People who think that investments deserve more respect than basic human needs, and it has set up a system designed to ensure that some people just spiral downwards. People on this board today are choosing to continue to uphold a racist, classist system that pushes black and brown people and low and moderate income working families spiraling further downward into cyclic poverty and out of their homes. In New York City, 72% of tenants behind on their rent are people of color. Why is that? It's because the exact system that John described in his segment is designed to keep our communities struggling. Any notions by this board and its members, and this argument is made more than once, mind you, that tenants should rely on more social safety net programs or subsidies from the government emphasizes the truth that many of us understand, that the systemic and institutional racism that have been cornerstones in this country's history persist in these spaces. Shame on this administration and any administration that would put members in place Shame on this administration and any administration that would put members in place on this board that clearly believe that investments deserve more respect than people. How can it be so obvious that a board full of non-elected public members is not genuinely representing the interests of the public, or even have a basic understanding of their plight? This RGB process has been performative and at best, and for that, tenants of this city, I am truly sorry. To the countless courageous tenants that came out to testify in public and virtually, even when members of this board took little to no interest or paid you far less attention than you deserve, we hear you, we see you, we understand you, and we hurt with you. Your outrage is completely legitimate. To the numerous housing advocates, housing experts at CSS, UNHP, Just Fix, and beyond, to legal service providers and organizers, and to the tenant movement at large, we thank you for your time and gargantuan efforts despite this unjust process. In closing, the main takeaway I have from my first year on this board is that this process and this board needs serious revamping. For this administration to allow such a performative debacle play out under the guise of neutrality is unconscionable, and your decisions will result in millions of people suffering while corporations and investors continue to profit. That is not why this board was created, nor is it in line with our mandate, which is supposed to be, and I quote, prevent exactions of unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive rents and rental agreements, and to forestall profiteering, speculation, and other disruptive practices tending to produce threats to the public health, safety, and general welfare. Nowhere in that statute does it charge the board with maximizing or protecting landlord profits. If we're not going to follow the basic language of the rent stabilization law's mandate, how can the public have any confidence in this process, and why even have it at all? I hope that in the years to come, this administration, future administrations, and the board will seriously consider this year's failure of process and inequity regarding data that is presented to the board and the board's actual mandate, or more and more people will truly see its illegitimacy. Thank you.
Is there a second for this motion?
And now, I move to adopt. Yeah, okay. I move to adopt the final language of Proposal 4 of Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 that was circulated to the members of the board and posted on the RGB website on June 17th. And I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 substantially in the form submitted by staff to the board as of June 17th, 2022, and to be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adopted rental adjustments. A summary of Proposal 4 is as follows. For apartments, a 1-year lease of 0%. For 2-year lease of 2%. Lofts, 1-year increase period for 0%. 2-year increase period for 2%. Special guidelines and decontrolled units, 27% above the maximum base rent.
Is there a second for the motion?
I second it.
Okay, is there any discussion on the motion?
Yes, I'd like to say something.
Yes.
Okay, so I want to address, this is in part, I mean, it's like as a comment to what's been said about the role of the RGB in determining rent adjustments year after year. In particular, I want to address the assertion that's been made during these RGB hearings over the past few months. You know, the assertion that the only way for owners to cover their operating expenses is to raise the rent. Landlord representatives have told us at these hearings that since the HSTPA housing reforms in 2019 closed their alternative avenues of raising rents beyond the levels that are voted on by this board, that they now depend on high enough increases from this board in order to keep up with increases in operating expenses. This is simply not true. The only way that this could be true is that if you think of the rent-stabilized housing market as a closed system where the only input is rent. Every year, year after year, we're stuck in a causal chain that begins with annual rent increases, which increase the assessed value of buildings, which increases the tax burden, which in turn increases operating expenses, such that landlords come back the following year to ask for another rent increase, and the cycle begins again, okay? And those of us, us and you, I mean, it's like who have been coming to these hearings year after year, know that we have the same conversations every year, whether or not there's a pandemic. But the fact is that rents do not have to be the only input into this system. Government has a whole set of policy levers at their disposal that they're simply not touching because it's more politically expedient to just let us on the RGB take the fall for a rent increase. Taxes on multifamily buildings are extremely high in New York City compared to 1 to 3 family homes, and advocates for both owners and tenants have been trying to get that changed for years without success. And taxes are by far the biggest chunk of owners' operating expenses at 36% of total expenses. Everything else pales in comparison. Although water and sewage rates have gone up this year, they account for just 9% of expenses. Maintenance, which is a constantly debated topic on this board, is 16%. Landlords are complaining that costs are going up when in fact, government can control the biggest of their expenses. One part of government is sending owners a tax bill, while the other, the RGB, is passing that tax bill over to tenants. Tenants cannot be expected to shoulder the responsibility for maintaining a decent housing stock solely through paying more in rent. It's unsustainable. If our elected officials truly care about affordable, well-maintained housing as a human right, as we've heard several times, I mean, it's like in testimony, they will use their powers to make sure that landlords have the money they need to make repairs. Not just pressure the RGB to get the money from the tenants. I don't know how the rest of you on the rest of my colleagues on the board feel, but speaking for myself, I feel like I'm being placed in an unfair position of being forced to increase rents to preserve landlords' bottom line, because other parts of government are not stepping up to resolve the housing affordability and maintenance crisis. There are several ways in which lawmakers here in the city and in Albany can supplement the the RGB's limited role in balancing the needs of tenants and landlords. The first is to find a way to lower the tax burden on multifamily rent-stabilized properties so as to provide relief on the biggest component of landlords' operating costs. The second would be to provide a more generous tax abatements for major maintenance and capital expenditures. For instance, if a boiler breaks down or the roof starts to leak or there's some other critical maintenance issue to address, allow a landlord to deduct the cost of repairs and upgrades from their taxes. Such a system would help all landlords, especially the small landlords who are testifying to this board that they're afraid of not being able to keep up with maintenance. Though current law provides some tax abatements to landlords, they still require some of the cost to be borne by the tenants. Changes to the tax burden on multifamily buildings and more generous tax abatements for maintenance and major capital expenditures are much more targeted ways of keeping the city's rent-stabilized housing stock in good shape compared to just having tenants shoulder the burden by paying more in rent. Our own data from the Housing and Vacancy Survey show that the median tenant of rent-stabilized units are paying 36% of their income on rent. This rent-to-income ratio has been going up since the year 2000. This means that by HUD's definition, the median tenant is rent-burdened. Depending on annual rent increases to cover increasing the tax burden is simply unsustainable. We need to blow up this system. We need to blow up this endless causal chain of rent increases that result in higher assessments, which result in higher tax burdens. We need to end this system that depends solely on higher rents to properly maintain the housing stock. Rent-stabilized housing is not a closed system. Rent does not have to be the only source of funds to cover maintenance costs. Our elected officials must step up to create tax abatements for maintenance or to reform the tax structure that unfairly burdens multifamily buildings. You can't just kick the can over to the RGB. That's not fair to us, and certainly not fair to the tenants who have to pay higher and higher rents, or the landlords who are forced to choose between paying their tax bill or replacing the roof. Thank you.
Is there any other discussion on the motion? Any other discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. We're voting on proposal number 4. Oh, wait. Shayla?
So I think I just want to make an observation. This is our motion. It is likely going to fail because of all of the points that Ann mentioned earlier. But I think it's important to recognize the effort and what tenants had to testify through. People falling asleep on their phones. Let's just like a reminder that tenants are doing just fine. The pandemic is almost over. But we are in a venue where you need a booster to get in. You need a mask. So clearly it's not over. Clearly the pandemic is still real. And all these folks are the people we are going to impact by our decision. So when we all go home to our comfort, to our comfort of our homes, which I thankfully have a safe home to go to, I will be thinking of the countless folks who testified on Zoom. The countless folks who testified on Zoom and we just click to the next person. Thank you, next. Thank you, next. With the understanding that they weren't really listening. And I want to thank you for sitting there, even though you knew that. I want to thank you for sitting, that woman who testified while someone was asleep on the board. Thank you for continuing, because I see you. The disrespect this year is insane. And let's not glance over the fact that when all failed, when every other excuse to increase rents failed, small owners, inflation, like we don't go to the grocery store, and when all that failed, it was, are tenants really hurting? The out-of-touchness that we have on this board is insane. There is a reason why you are not the ones up here. And that is what we're talking about when we talk about the fix is in. Every year, 9 years, I have been on this board. Never have I had a chair not reach out because they were just going to do what they were going to do. At least there was a level of respect we had for each other. And that is not how we're having these conversations. And that's okay, because we have you guys to back us up. We will be back, and you can replace us. It's okay. I'll come back and testify, just like all of you.
Any other discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. We're voting on proposal number 4. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
No.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
No.
Shayla Garcia, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
Yes.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
No.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
No.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
No.
Adon Soltran, how do you vote?
Yes.
David Reese? No. The motion fails by a vote of 3 to 6. Okay. All right. Following our practice, do the owners have a proposal?
Yes.
I think it's number 1. Yeah.
We would like to make a statement first, if you may.
Fine.
As we put forth our proposals, we would like to make a few observations. This process is unfortunate. This board has been given the very difficult task of administering a rent adjustment, virtually guaranteeing that both renters and their housing providers will lose. This happens every year. The cost of housing continues to go up. Elected officials do little to nothing to stop it, and yet this board is tasked with making an impossible decision.
As a board, if we keep rents significantly lower than operating expenses, we are risking the decay of rent-stabilized housing. Our own data shows us that this is starting to happen. We're seeing less long-term capital investment and maintenance. And when you factor in mortgage payments, roughly half of the buildings with more than 80% rent-stabilized housing are in distress. These are the buildings outside of core Manhattan that low-income New Yorkers rely on the most.
A rent adjustment that would be high enough to cover the rising costs would likely be in the range of 6% to 8% on a one-year lease, which would be a significant shock to many renters. The preliminary range proposed by this board clearly took that into consideration. It is a range that distributes the high cost of inflation, growing property taxes, rising water rates, and a host of unfunded mandates put forth by the City Council disproportionately on property owners instead of the tenant.
Our vote today is out of necessity to find balance between the tenant's burden to pay and a property owner's ability to maintain housing that is safe, clean, and livable. But whatever we do, nobody wins. The only way to make housing more affordable and better quality in New York is if the government moves to resolve the root problems that lead us to this point each year, where owners and renters are pitted against each other in political theater to fight over scraps.
Our hope is that the government will do a better job for the next year in addressing these problems, so that when we reconvene next year, our job won't be so difficult in determining what a reasonable rent adjustment should be in order to protect the rent stabilization system.
We want to thank our fellow board members who take this responsibility very seriously, who have advocated well on behalf of tenants, owners, and the public. Also, a special thank you to the staff, Andrew, Brian, Danielle, and Charmaine, who make our collective jobs easier.
I move to adopt the final language of Proposal 1 of Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 that was circulated to the members of the board and posted on the RGB website on June 17th. And I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 substantially in the form submitted by the staff to the board as of June 17, 2022, and to be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adopted rental adjustments. A summary of Proposal 1 is as follows. Apartments, 1-year lease, 6%. 2-year lease, 9%. Lofts, 1-year increase period, 6%. 2-year increase period, 9%. Special guideline and decontrolled units, 27% above the maximum base rent.
We have a second for the motion.
I second the motion.
Is there further discussion on the motion? Any further discussion on the motion? Shayla Garcia.
Can we just recognize that the landlord just gave the same argument we undid weeks ago? Rent increases does not translate to better condition for tenants. It does not translate for better living conditions for tenants. It does not translate for more stable housing for tenants. It just means landlords can do a little bit more of whatever they want to do, including purchasing buildings. So this idea of money will trickle down for better conditions is false. False. I think we figured that out with Reagan. Like, the fact that we're having the conversation as if this is factual is insane to me. Small owners make less than 1%. There are no small owners in the city like that. We are not making a decision on them. And so let's be real, that this is the same messaging we have heard for decades. Before this, after this, let's be vigilant to call it out every chance we get.
Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. We're voting on proposal number 1. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
No.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
Yes.
Shayla Garcia, how do you vote?
No.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
No.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
No.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
No.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
Yes.
Adon Soltran, how do you vote?
No.
David Reese votes no. The motion fails by a vote of 2-7. Okay, I move to adopt the final language of Proposal 10 of Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 that was circulated to the members of the board and posted on the RGB website on June 17th. And I further move to adopt the explanatory statement and findings for Apartment and Loft Order Number 54 substantially in the form submitted by staff to the board as of June 17th, 2022, and to be modified by the RGB staff after this meeting to reflect the adopted rental adjustments. A summary of Proposal 10 is as follows. Apartments, 1-year lease, 3.25%. 2-year lease, 5%. Lofts, 1-year increase period, 3.25%. 2-year increase period, 5%. Special guideline and decontrolled units, 27% above the maximum base rent. I would like to make a few brief comments on why I support this proposal. For the last 2 years, this board has met under unprecedented conditions. We were in the midst of a worldwide pandemic which had upended the lives of New Yorkers. In the last year, the situation has stabilized with so many New Yorkers vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus. That is not to say that the crisis is fully over. In the last couple of months, many members of this board and the staff have gotten sick, but thankfully none too seriously. Although we are wearing masks here today, mask mandates have begun to lift in many situations, workplaces, daycares, schools, and airports. That being said, some New Yorkers are still becoming gravely ill from the virus, and some have had to deal with the lingering effects of long COVID. The board's deliberations took place in this context. By law, the board is required to review and consider, amongst other things, the economic condition of the residential real estate industry in New York City, including such factors as the prevailing and projected real estate taxes and sewer and water rates, gross operating maintenance costs, costs and availability of financing and interest rates, supply of housing and vacancy rates, and relevant data from the current and projected cost of living indices for New York City, and such other data as have been made available to us. Our consideration of these factors took place in the context of the lingering effects of the pandemic. With this in mind, I would like to lay out the reasons why I believe that these are appropriate adjustments. First, we must recognize that rental housing remains scarce. Per data from the 2021 New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, selected initial findings published by the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development in May of 2022, the overall net rental vacancy rate was 4.54% in 2021. The housing emergency, as defined in the rent stabilization law, hinges on the statutory recognition that a vacancy rate of less than 5% creates abnormal market conditions. This indicator falls under the definition of a housing emergency, allowing this board to set lease adjustments. The RGB's 2022 Price Index of Operating Costs gathers prices for a market basket of goods and services used in the operation and maintenance of rent-stabilized buildings in New York City, and uses these prices to estimate cost price changes from one year to the next. This year, overall prices for owner expenses increased 4.2% in the PIOC for rent-stabilized apartment buildings. Underlying this rise were significant increases in certain categories of expenses, including a 19.6% rise in the cost of fuel, as well as a rise in the insurance cost and maintenance of 10.9% and 9.2% respectively. At the same time, as noted in supplemental RPIE data to the board's 2022 income and expense study, there's evidence that some owners are having trouble mitigating rising costs with their ability to maintain revenue. This is particularly true for buildings that have a high proportion of stabilized units that lie outside of core Manhattan and were built prior to 1974. This group of buildings have few sources of income growth other than the rent adjustments approved by this board. Data shows that buildings built before 1974 that are 100% stabilized outside of core Manhattan show a decline in net operating cost of 2.5%. The decline in NOI for these buildings occurs in a context where such buildings already have cost-to-income ratios that are quite high. The unaudited cost-to-income ratio for buildings that are 100% stabilized is 68.4% amongst pre-1974 buildings. In other words, old or fully stabilized buildings have high cost-to-income ratios that may become unsustainable in the near future, particularly if inflation remains at its current high levels. Compounding this increase in costs is the increase in mortgage interest rates. The 2022 mortgage survey report shows that average interest rates for new multifamily mortgages increased to 3.91% this year, the first increase in 4 years. The rise in owner costs viewed alone supports an increase in rent adjustments, but this board would be remiss if it didn't consider tenants' ability to pay rent as a factor in setting lease adjustments. Housing is typically considered affordable when a household pays no more than 30% of its income in rent. Based upon data from the 2021 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the most current HVS data available, the median contract rent-to-income ratio for rent-stabilized tenants, excluding those tenants who receive vouchers and other rental assistance, was 30%. This means that half of rent-stabilized tenants who do not receive some form of rental assistance were paying at least 30% of their income in rent and were considered rent-burdened. In addition, 31% of these same rent-stabilized tenants pay more than 50% of household income towards contract rent. All these statistics point to a single fact: rent-stabilized housing is unaffordable for many tenants. Tenants continue to suffer from high unemployment, 6.7% in the first quarter of 2022, but significantly lower than 9.9% average unemployment in 2021. Wages continue to grow, but the rate of those employed is much lower than prior to the pandemic. Although evictions are low, it is also expected that both non-payment filings and evictions will increase sharply by the end of 2022, following the end of the eviction moratorium. The federal and state governments have provided some assistance here. As of April, ERAP funds have provided 107,311 payments issued on behalf of New York City tenants, covering $1.5 billion of rent arrears, with additional funds of nearly $350 million available for pending applications. The recently enacted fiscal year 2023 New York State budget allocates an additional $800 million in state funding for ERAP, but those funds will not reach everyone in need of rent assistance. The board has balanced these factors as well as the current inflationary environment that owners and tenants alike find themselves in. The inflation rate in New York City metro area was 5.5% in the first quarter of '22, lower than inflation in the U.S. as a whole, 8%, but 4 percentage points higher than the first quarter of 2021, and has continued to rise since. It is important to note that the RGB's modest rent adjustments in the past year contributed to a lower consumer price index in the New York City metro area over the last year, and for stabilized tenants in particular, as housing costs make up a significant portion of the CPI. Finally, I note that the passage of the HSTPA in 2019 squarely places the burden of providing owners with enough revenue to maintain their buildings on the RGB. Therefore, I believe that the commensurate rent adjustments calculated by staff should play a more significant role in our deliberations than in past years. This proposal falls closer to the lower end of the commensurate rent adjustments, which range from 2.7% to 4.5% for one-year leases and 4.3% to 9% for two-year leases. I believe that this proposal best balances the need of owners who must pay for costs that are increasing significantly, as well as those of tenants who are still dealing with the lingering effects of the pandemic. Based upon all of these factors, I support proposal number 10 of apartment and loft order number 54. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. Alex Schwartz, second.
Yep.
Is there any discussion on the motion?
Yes, I'd like to ask something. I'd like to ask if the public members can each provide an explanation as to why they're choosing to raise people's rents by these high percentages. I think that the people here deserve to know, frankly, from every public member who's voting for this proposal, why that should happen.
Is there any further discussion on the motion? Hearing none, I call the question. We're voting on proposal number 10. Christina DeRose, how do you vote?
Yes.
Robert Ehrlich, how do you vote?
Pass.
Shayla Garcia, how do you vote?
No.
Christian Gonzalez Rivera, how do you vote?
No.
Arpit Gupta, how do you vote?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz, how do you vote?
Yes.
Christina Smith, how do you vote?
Yes.
Adnan Sultran, how do you vote?
Absolutely not.
David Reese votes yes. The motion passes by a vote of 5-6. Wait, I'm sorry. Robert, I didn't take your vote.
I'll vote no.
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 Okay. The motion passes by a vote of 5 to 4. Is that right? Okay. We've concluded our agenda for tonight. Is there a motion to adjourn? Christina DeRose makes a motion to adjourn. Is there a second?
Second.
Second from Christina Smith. Thank you all for your service. Good night to all.